Known as the Pearl of the Orient for its beauty before World War II, Manila, a bustling city and the center of politics and business in the Philippines, has not captured its pre-war beauty since 1945. The reason is simple: Manila was destroyed at the end of World War II. Following their 1946 independence from the United States, Filipinos and their government relied on the US and its money to rebuild a war-torn economy. For the US, rebuilding quickly was one of the keys to getting the Philippines back on its feet and preventing a potential communist revolution in the country, which was a distinct possibility. We are about to tell you about the Battle of Manila, which took place in February 1945 and sadly included one of the more tragic episodes of that tragic war. Watch this video if you're over 18 or with parental supervision, because it contains detailed information about wartime atrocities unsuitable for younger viewers. Most of the islands of the Philippines were conquered by Spain in the 16th century. In 1521, Spain claimed the islands, and in 1571, Manila was founded. The location of the Philippines is strategically important. So they are today, and they have been since the 1500s. The Spanish used them as a jumping-off point for trading, exploration, and military missions in the Pacific, and they were used by ships heading to China and Japan as a resupply point. On the way home, Spanish and Portuguese ships used the islands to resupply before the long journey home, or to South America, where both nations had colonies. The islands were given their modern name in 1543, named for the then Prince but future King of Spain, Philip II, 1527–98, of Spanish Armada 1588 fame. By the time the Spanish-American War began in 1898, the Philippines had been Spanish for over 375 years. By 1898, many, if not most, Filipinos were Catholic, one of the Roman Catholic Church's success stories in Asia. To a large degree, the Philippines looked towards Europe, and after 1898, America rather than Asia, for its economic and political future. Filipino culture today, at least in most major cities, especially Manila, is a hybrid between the many indigenous cultures and people and that of the West, making it quite unique. In 1898, the Spanish-American War began over the status of Cuba, and the infamous incident in which the US battleship Maine sank in Havana Harbor. We now know that the USS Maine did sink because of an internal accident, as the Spanish claimed. But at the time, American imperial designs, primitive investigation work, and the emergence of a countrywide mass media in the USA caused many Americans to jump to the same conclusion: Spain had attacked the United States. The two countries went to war in April 1898. By July, the war was over. Spain had been shown to be the declining power that many thought it was, and the United States the rising world power. The most important battle of the war was the Battle of Manila Bay, in which the modern US Navy defeated the antiquated Spanish Pacific Fleet. One of the results of the conflict was that the United States would take possession of the Philippines. The Philippines provided an excellent location for the growing United States Navy. The islands could be used as a base and resupply point for US ships in the Pacific, and put China and Japan, to name just two nations, within easy range of the US fleet. The role of the United States in the Philippines was peculiar. America had used, and would continue to use words like freedom and independence, but had now gained two overseas colonies from Spain, the Philippines and Puerto Rico. In the Philippines, many islanders were not interested in trading Spanish colonial control for American control, and a quite bloody and savage war took place between United States troops and Filipino insurgents from 1899 to 1902. Most recognized the ideal strategic location of the islands, but were troubled by the idea of an America with overseas colonies. Even Theodore Roosevelt, an American imperialist if there ever was one, was troubled by the idea. Over the next 20 to 30 years, American and Filipino leaders agreed that the islands would be independent in 1946. The fact that 1946 just happened to be the year after World War II ended was coincidental. That year, the US recognized the new nation of the Philippines, though they retained the right to base the United States Pacific Fleet at Subic Bay on the Bataan Peninsula. By mutual agreement, the base was closed in 1992, though the US still uses a variety of bases in the islands. The years just before the outbreak of World War II, knowledgeable people in the United States and Japan understood that the likelihood of war, or at least conflict, between the two nations was highly likely. Both countries were going through remarkable periods of change, and both were dynamic, growing powers. American economic and military interests were shifting westward across the Pacific, and the Japanese were expanding in almost every direction. In 1896, the Japanese victory over China, the First Sino-Japanese War, gave them possession of the Korean peninsula to the north of Japan and the large Chinese island of Taiwan to the south. Additionally, Japan gained important concessions on the Chinese mainland, meaning that it controlled parts of coastal Chinese cities like many of the more powerful European countries. In 1905, the Japanese inflicted a stunning defeat on the Russian Empire and took over a former Russian-controlled port in China and other concessions. In 1937, Japanese planes accidentally attacked the American gunboat Panay on the Yangtze River in the Chinese city of Nanking during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese insisted the attack was an accident. It paid reparations for the damage and deaths caused. Many historians today believe the attack to be a deliberate act, testing American resolve. In 1940, the Japanese took over the former French colony of Indochina, today's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, when France was defeated by Japan's ally Hitler. Since the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, the United States had applied increasing economic and diplomatic pressure on Japan, in the hopes of blunting or rolling back Japanese expansion, but to no avail. Not least among other American concerns was the idea that should they not be stopped, the Japanese would attempt to seize the Philippines, and war would result. For the United States, the Philippines were a naval buffer against expansion by a hostile power in the Pacific. For Japan, the islands were a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan, and the Americans held that dagger. The USA placed a growing embargo on Japan in response to Japanese aggression in the Pacific. Primary among these goods were steel and oil. The United States was the world's leading producer of both commodities in the 1940s. In addition, the resource-poor Japanese relied on American oil to power their armed forces, especially their navy. When the US banned oil and steel exports, Japan began to consider an expansion into not only Indochina, but into oil-rich Indonesia, a Dutch possession at the time as well. That could not be done if the United States retained control of the Philippines. By mid-fall 1941, the Japanese had formulated their plan to attack the United States in the Pacific. One of their main goals was the seizure of the Philippine Islands. The Japanese inflicted a severe and humiliating defeat on combined US-Filipino troops in the late winter, early spring of 1942. Underestimated, the Japanese outmaneuvered the Americans and drove them from the islands. General Douglas MacArthur, governor and military commander in the Philippines, famously vowed, "I shall return," and escaped, but many of his troops were taken prisoner. This resulted in the infamous Bataan Death March, yet another in the long list of war crimes the Japanese had already committed in China and elsewhere and would commit until the war's end. By early 1945, however, Japan was retreating in the face of the overwhelming industrial and military might of the United States. Throughout the war, many Filipinos risked and often lost their lives to supply the Americans with critical intelligence about Japanese positions in Manila and elsewhere. The Japanese commander of the Philippines was Army General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Yamashita knew that attempting to hold Manila against the greater numbers and firepower of the Americans was futile, and he ordered a withdrawal into the hills and jungles of Luzon, the main Philippine island where Manila was located. Yamashita also knew his troops were cut off from any supplies from Japan. The US Navy dominated the waters around the Philippines. However, he would fight a guerrilla war in the jungle as long as possible, hoping to cause the Americans to leave a substantial number of troops in the islands, troops they couldn't use to invade Japan. Throughout the war, the Japanese military was divided against itself to a large degree. The army had wanted to confine the war to the Asian mainland. They believed there was more access to vital resources and less dependence on oil. The Navy, however, being a navy, did not want to be a shuttle service for reinforcements and supplies for army units in China and Indochina. They also believed a buffer in the Pacific against the USA was necessary to keep Japan safe. By 1945, however, the point of the argument was moot, but bad feelings between Army and Navy units, including the fanatic Imperial Japanese Navy Marines, continued. Commanding the Naval Infantry and Marines in Manila was Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, who refused to leave Manila and declared that he and his men would die there rather than surrender to the Americans. Iwabuchi concentrated most of his forces in the oldest section of the capital, called Intramuros, inside the walls, where the Spanish had begun the building of Manila. Intramuros was less than half a square mile in size, but was crowded with buildings and people. The walls of Intramuros were 8 feet thick and more than 20 feet high in places. Strong points were built into the walls and created in buildings throughout the area. The Japanese would defend the rest of Manila outside the walls until their position became untenable. Then, most of the surviving Japanese would retreat into the Intramuros area, where Iwabuchi had his headquarters. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were caught between the 20,000 or so fanatical and desperate defenders, the 35,000 US troops, and 3,500 Filipino fighters. Many people think that the Marine Corps did most of the fighting in the Pacific by the USA. However, there were more Army troops than Marines in the Pacific theater, and they had fought across the huge island of New Guinea and other places in the Southwest Pacific to reach the Philippines. Though many of the soldiers were combat veterans by the time of the retaking of the Philippines, a sizable portion were not, and almost all of them were unfamiliar with fighting in an urban environment. And unlike in the jungles of New Guinea, there would be large numbers of civilians present. A Day in History has already released a video on the Japanese atrocity in the city of Nanking, in China in 1937, which history remembers as the Rape of Nanking. In February, the Rape of Manila occurred. Even before the Americans entered the city, leaflets in English and Tagalog, the language of most Filipinos, urged them to flee the area as soon as possible. For most of Manila's inhabitants, attempting to escape was as dangerous as remaining in place. Most, but not all of the civilians in Manila were women and children, and they were the first ones attempting to escape the fighting. Unfortunately, many were caught between the two armed forces and killed in the fighting. Worse still, the Japanese cut down many who might have made it to American lines as they fled. Many civilians, including babies and children, were used as human shields by the Japanese. Many civilians were forced into buildings used as strongpoints by the Japanese Marines. Thousands were killed in the fighting, many by the Japanese before they committed suicide or retreated into Intramuros. Before the war, the Bayview Hotel had been the location of MacArthur's penthouse office. During the Battle of Manila, it was used as a place to assault women and girls sexually. Some 400 women and girls as young as 12 were rounded up and taken to the hotel. 25 of them were selected for their appearance, including those young girls, and the rest were taken away, most never to be seen again. Many of those rejected at the Bayview Hotel were raped in the area outside the hotel, then killed. Many women had brought their young children and infants. These were bayoneted. At times, drunk and fanatic Japanese troops entertained themselves by tossing babies in the air and spitting them on their bayonets. They did this. Witnesses survived. Bodies were found, accounts exist, and you can read and see them at Memorare Manila 1945 on Facebook. Within the hotel, horror occurred. many soldiers assaulted a young woman. The last of them sliced off her breasts, then drunkenly paraded around the hotel, holding them to his chest to the laughter of his comrades. Some women were raped, then doused in gasoline and set alight. One girl struggled against her attacker and had part of her head hacked off. The rape continued until she died. By February 1945, the Americans were too familiar with the Japanese unwillingness to surrender. That left them with what is sometimes called a choiceless choice. They knew that if they fought into the city, Intramuros especially, the Japanese would use civilians as human shields while they killed US troops. Also, knowing that surrounding and waiting the Japanese out would only result in the Japanese committing suicide after they killed every civilian they could, the Americans decided to press the battle. The Americans used every possible weapon to seize Manila and Intramuros. TNT charges, flamethrowers, both handheld and on tanks, aerial bombing, including white phosphorus, continued almost continuously, at least during daylight hours. In addition, 155mm guns were brought into the city, along with every other kind of artillery, mortars, and tank gun possible. Finally, massive 240mm guns were brought into the city and used to blast holes in the thick walls of Intramuros. The American battlefield commanders, Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold and Major General Robert Baitler, believed ending the battle as quickly as possible was the best way to save as many American and Filipino lives as possible. The decision has come under fire since 1945. Initially, MacArthur, who loved the Philippines, restricted the use of artillery and air power, fearing substantial civilian casualties. But as the battle went on, he lifted those restrictions. One of the most deadly effects of the fight was fire, as most of Manila consisted of wooden buildings. No one knows the exact number of civilians killed by bombing, artillery, and the fires which resulted, compared to those killed directly by the Japanese in their mass atrocities. However, we know that at least 100,000 civilians lost their lives during the battle, and that Manila was almost entirely flattened. Virtually no Japanese troops were captured. All died in combat or by their own hands, including Admiral Iwabuchi. General Yamashita was tried after the war for war crimes committed by his troops in 1945 and before. He was executed in 1946 in the Philippines. If you found this video interesting, please tell your friends and like and subscribe to our growing channel.